it was nice to see everybody join Kelly for her presentation, and it's nice to have everybody here today for some interest in the topic. And, Amy is going to do most of the talking today, but I really wanted to kick it off. There was some interest, and I know a lot of people attended the Pennsylvania legislative hearing that was held, and then had some questions about this study. So while I kick it off, Amy's gonna just give a general overview of why we are looking at this study again, and where it's coming from. But I just want to say before that, one of my goals as the president of WRA is really to bring about this one basin concept. We are one basin, it is one river, and it's really important that we work together on these issues. And I know that, especially coming from me, being from New York City, a lot of people take that with a grain of salt. And I know that in the past, perhaps, New York City hasn't always been as open and willing to work with others and share information. But new people come along, and attitudes change, and ways of working do change. And that really is a goal, because we do believe that what happens in the upper basin, and we know it has a direct effect of what happens in the lower basin, but it's also the same. What happens in the lower basin has a direct effect about what happens in the upper basin. And this concept of using F.E. Walter Reservoir to augment flows in the river, it's not new. The idea of using F.E. Walter during times of severe drought, that idea has been around longer than I've been alive, to be honest. It's something that has been looked at, as early as the late 70s, early 80s. And it's been studied several times at this point. And here we are studying it again. And the purpose of this study is to see if we can use some storage in F.E. Walter, to help augment the flows in the river during times of drought. I don't think anybody would disagree that more water in the river during times of drought is a bad thing. And perhaps having more water come from F.E. Walter will give us some flexibility to change the way that flows are managed in the river currently, without causing problems for anyone on the river. So New York City and DRBC are co-sponsors for this study, along with the Philadelphia District Corps of Engineers. The reason we have co-sponsors, and that's not a typical thing, is that we wanted to make sure that both the basin states and all of the decree parties were both represented as part of this study. So whereas DRBC has all of the basin states and not New York City, and the federal government, which the Philadelphia district is, the decree parties, we're the only outlier there. So we decided to come together and do this together so that there was full representation across the board. And, the decree party representatives and the DRBC commissioners have been briefed on the status of this study. So with that, Amy, I will turn it over to you and let you go through the slides here.
Okay, so can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You can hear me, okay. So I put this slide in here just in case we post this presentation, but this Delaware River Basin is all, is near and dear to you all. So I will just go over it, but I just want to mention that F.E. Walter is located in Carbon County. So this is where it's located in relation to the rest of the basin. So as Jen mentioned, F.E. Walter's been around for a long time. It was authorized for construction in 1940 as part of the Flood Control Act and was completed in 1961. The dam created 35 billion gallons of flood control space. And since its creation, it has prevented $206 million in flood damages since and that's in 2015 dollars. Although it was constructed as a flood control reservoir, the Corps began storing and releasing water for whitewater rafting as early as 1968. That program has developed over time. During the recreation season, the Corps stores 6 billion gallons of water, and they use those releases early in the spring for fishing, fisheries releases, and then for boating and then whitewater recreation. In 1998, Congress authorized F.E. Walter for recreation, and approximately 75,000 people per year participate in whitewater rafting at F.E. Walter. There's no permanent water supply storage in the reservoir. However, water has been stored in F.E. Walter for 9 distinct drought events. Storage has occurred up to 11 billion gallons. And according to the drought program, drought storage is not initiated in the basin until the basin goes into drought. So as Jen mentioned, use of F.E. Walter for low flow augmentation has been around for a long time. And in 1985, there was a proposed modification to F.E. Walter to create a 22 billion gallon permanent pool for a water supply. And there would also have been the same flood control and recreation. DRBC previously had a contract with the Corps for drought water supply storage, but they discontinued the contract in the mid 1990s after a change in the Corps' water supply pricing policy. So one of the reasons for this project is trying to get that contract going. In the Water Resources Reform and Develop Act of 2014, the Corps was given the authority to enter into an agreement with DRBC for temporary water supply and conservation storage during a drought warning or a drought emergency. And as a result, and in that authorization and a prior authorization, the cost to DRBC would be for the incremental operating costs, not the typical water supply storage costs. So anyway, the study was authorized in 2019, and if you were around back then, more than 800 people showed up at the informational public meeting on January 9th, and most of the concerned citizens were felt that recreation might be adversely impacted. So the purpose of the study, DRBC has broad authorities related to water supply and allocation, flooding, and even recreation. However, the reason why we in New York City pursued the F.E. Walter study is because it is a vital component of our drought management plan, which was established in the Water Code and is incorporated into federal law by reference. Although the drought management plan in the Water Code includes storage of up to 11 billion gallons for drought mitigation, the Corps has indicated that due to potential dam safety issues, they would only store 6 billion gallons of water for drought relief. Considering sea level rise and climate change, our planning analyses show that we need more than 6 billion gallons from F.E. Walter to make it through a drought, repeat of the drought records successfully. Our analyses also indicate that there will be little to no impact on recreation other than those impacts that would normally occur in drought-like conditions, for instance, the not enough water getting into the reservoir. And then we also feel that forecast-informed reservoir operations can be used so that no additional flood risk is created when storing water for drought conditions. Some of the other non-sponsor related requests are tower modifications for water quality, for temperature modification for fisheries, and preserving the existing recreation program. The study is going to allow us to work with the Corps to determine what is needed to ensure the use of F.E. Walter for drought emergency storage and still maintain the reservoir's existing authorized purposes of flood mitigation and recreation. So here's the original list of project alternatives. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative, and it's always evaluated as part as a federal project. So that would be like if we don't change what we're doing now. One of the alternatives was raising the dam similar to that 1985 modification I mentioned. And that was eliminated early from consideration because it's believed to be too expensive. It would be in excess of $500 million. Most of the other alternatives are related and would become components of a larger plan. For instance, operations can potentially be modified to get more storage, but a new tower and raising the pool would also likely require new operations. Right now, our focus is on alternative 2, which there'll be a little bit more information about later on. And that would be storing water at higher elevations for drought management, with like basically storage to 11 billion gallons. And then also what structural improvements that at the dam might be needed in order for us to do so. And that might be, it could be a new tower, it could be grouting, there might need to be some downstream stream protection. So there are all sorts of different things that need to go into the evaluation. Like an alternative 6 and 7, might be pursued if the Corps' analysis indicated that the current level of flood protection couldn't be maintained by FE Walter as it is. They completed their analysis called the probable maximum flood, and found that that flood could be passed without incident. So I don't know how much investigation they'll do on those 2 alternatives. So just to explain a little bit about how FE Walter operations would work. So reservoir operations are often defined by rule curves, and this is a graph of the rule curves for FE Walter. The rule curves define what happens at different storage levels for different purposes. This is the date in the year on the x-axis, and the pool elevation is on the on the y-axis. The blue lines are for recreation, and the red and green lines are for drought. This area below elevation 1300 is called the sediment reserve pool, and you cannot use water from that part of the reservoir, primarily because there's no, you can't get it from the intake. So if you look at this, the Corps begins to fill water in mid-March, trying to reach either 1365 or 1370 by April 30th. And while it's filling and through to the month of July, the Corps can make fisheries releases, and a couple, I think there's 1 or 2 whitewater releases that are scheduled, but it tries to maintain the elevation between 1365 and 1370 during that period. If the elevation on July 1st is 1365 to 1370, then all of the scheduled whitewater releases can occur, I think, through August, and then there's 1 or 2 additional releases that can occur if there's water available. For drought, in the water code, what would happen is water would be stored year-round during a drought at elevation 1370, which is 6 billion gallons, and then at the end of the winter, we would start to store water in FE Walter up to 1392, which would bring it to 11 billion gallons. And it would stay that, like, the water could get up as high as this level during the summer, unless you were using it, and then you would start to release it again late fall, so you have that lower storage pool in the wintertime to catch runoff. So here, the fishing releases would occur earlier in the season. There's still some fishing releases later in the season, but fishing and whitewater rafting occur later in the summer. So this is kind of how that releases from FE Walter occurred for the 2020 recreation program. And so you see these little rectangulars that bump up. And typically the Corps will release like 800 CFS for 12 hours to kind of create high flow conditions in the river for whitewater rafting. Interestingly enough, this big release here was to create some storage space for Isaias last year. I don't remember, August 4th, Isaias came up and threatened to bring a lot of rain to the area, and so these were releases for that. And then they dropped down to just above conservation for a while, and then these are the other, these are individual weekends, so other weekend releases occurred during that period of time. So if you look at that in the modeling, if we wanted to model, so this would we modeled the 2020 recreation program for if we had the same flows as 2009 under the current FFMP. And I just wanted to really show you this so you could see how the recreation program kind of plays out in the model. And so here you see the spring fisheries releases. They release up to 400 CFS. I think it's 1 or 2 days on the weekend. And so you can see all these weekends with fisheries releases. And then here after July, you see the whitewater releases. And these, when the releases are higher than the 400 or 600, that pretty much means that the reservoir is passing inflow. So it means that there's, we'll be releasing to bring the water down to one of those rule curves. And then usually by the end of the season, they store some water and they make what's called a mega release, where they release all the water in the reservoir on October, I think the holiday week, the first holiday weekend in October, to bring it back down to that elevation 1300. So I don't know if you mentioned that I mentioned that we thought that recreation and drought were not like mutually exclusive. And the reason why I say that is that actually releases during the summertime from Effie Walter do help. They do provide, they are flow augmentation releases. They're adding water to the river for whitewater recreation, but they're also helpful in sort of repelling salinity. But the interesting thing here was this is a summary of the drought periods in the basin. If you look from left to right, these are the days of the year by month. And then on the y-axis is year. And this basically, in this blue period here is from, I think, April 15th to, or this, there it's slightly shifted, April 15th to October 15th. And this indicates the periods of time when the basin is in some type of drought condition. Yellow is a drought watch, orange is a drought warning, red is a drought emergency, and then green are periods where the lower basin is in drought, but not the entire basin. The reason why I want to show this is because you can see that the majority of the time we are in drought conditions is not during the recreation season, and that the onset of drought usually most likely would happen after September, with a few cases where it comes in August. And we only have a few years where the entire recreation season would be a bust. This was this drought one here was 1985, and then this is probably like 64, 65, and 66. And we have another drought here done in the 1930s. So basically, so that's all I want to say about that. So that was recreation. So then we come to drought. When the study was initiated, sorry. So why would we need Effie Walter for drought mitigation? This is a picture of the Delaware River at Trenton near the head of tide, and it shows just how low the flow in the river was in the 1960s. DRBC's drought management program was developed in response to the drought of the 1960s, when salt water was able to move up into the estuary due to the lack of freshwater inflows. Typically, salinity in the estuary is low enough that water can be used for many purposes. However, during the 1960s, the salinity became so high that it was unsuitable for some uses and caused damage to equipment and infrastructure. Also of concern at that time was the potential infiltration of salt water into the Potomac Raritan-Magathie aquifer, known as the PMA, which was the source of water for the Camden area at the time. And the PRM, this aquifer, is located at River Mile 98, or that's the milestone location. Another concern was that oysters are mostly susceptible to parasites and disease at higher levels of salinity, and there was some concern that the oyster industry would collapse. So currently there are 52 facilities that withdraw water directly from the estuary, including the Philadelphia Water Department, the New Jersey American Water Company, and as well as many manufacturers and industry and thermoelectric power generators. Oops. So the primary goals of the drought management plan for the basin are salinity propulsion and preserving regional storage for worse conditions. So it makes sense that our drought management program would be based on storage. And we have a basin-wide and a lower basin drought management plan. Basin-wide drought management plan is based on the combined storage in the 3 New York City reservoirs, but Pacton, Canterville, and Neversink, excuse me. They are 3 of the 4 largest reservoirs in the basin and also in the headwaters. The lower basin plan is based on elevations of water in Blue Marsh and Beltsville, which are also federal reservoirs. And I'll talk about those more in a minute. There are many aspects to the plan, including water conservation, design standards, like systems should be designed to be able to function through the drought of record. There are phased reductions in out-of-basin diversions, releases, and flow objectives based on different drought levels defined by storage. There are also water conservation requirements, depleted use management, plumbing standards, water audits, a whole bunch of, and also there are some chloride criteria, which we'll talk about in a minute. During a drought emergency, the flow objectives are actually linked to the location of the salt front. And the salt front is an indicator of saline intrusion, and it's the 7-day average of the 250 milligram per liter isochlor. It's basically the 250 milligram per liter chloride concentration averaged over a 7-day period. So the linkage of the salt front and the flow objective is known as the vernier, and it applies to both the Trenton and the Montague flow objectives. The concept is really to save water until it's really needed or until it's most likely needed for saline repulsion. However, the flow objectives are significantly higher than the lowest flows of the 1960s drought, which were 870 CFS for Montague and 1920 CFS for Trenton. So the Trenton flow objective is almost 20% greater than the lowest flow during the drought in the 1960s. There are a whole bunch of other studies going on to examine the use of storage to meet the flow objectives during drought emergency and their effectiveness at meeting the saline management goal. You may have heard the term detachment, and detachment would mean that the flow objective would no longer be based on the salt front location in a drought emergency, but we're not going to discuss that today. So there is a little bit of a misconception in the basement in that people think we're managing for the location of the salt front. We're actually managing to keep the concentration of chlorides based on a 30-day moving average below 180 milligrams per liter. The saline management goal is there are 3 standards. One is for sodium, and there are 2 for chlorides. Chlorides in zone 2 and 3, and sodium in zone 2. Zone 2 is the area from Trenton, which is River Mile 133, to River Mile 108. River Mile 108 is 2 miles downstream of the drinking water intakes. And zone 3 is from River Mile 108 to River Mile 105. River Mile 105 is about 2 miles downstream from the Walt Whitman Bridge, and River Mile 98 is 1 mile upstream from the Walt Whitman Bridge. And so, although we do use the salt front as an indicator of saline intrusion, we're really trying to use low flow augmentation to meet these chloride standards. Oops. So how do we fulfill the goals of the drought management program? We have this, we use the releases from different reservoirs, and this is the water management schematic for the basin. So here are these 3, so the way it works is the 3 New York City reservoirs are located in the upper basin, and releases from those reservoirs are called for by the river master to meet a flow objective at Montague of 1750 CFS during normal conditions and scaled back during different drought targets or based on the salt front in a drought emergency. Then to meet Trenton, DRBC makes releases from Beltsville and Blue Marsh Reservoir, Trenton's down here. And in a drought emergency, releases can be called for from Lake Wallenpaupack, the Mongap system, F.E. Walter, and Lake Macomixon. So if you kind of put this in context, like this is obviously a map of the basin. So here, the New York City reservoirs are primarily responsible for meeting the flow objective at Trenton, but water from those reservoirs also helps meet the flow objective at, they're responsible for meeting the flow objective at Montague, but these releases also help in meeting the flow objective at Trenton. DRBC is responsible for making releases from these two reservoirs, Beltsville and Blue Marsh, to meet Trenton, but also but reservoirs from F.E. Walter, Lake Lompaupack, the Mine Gap system, and Naka Mixing can also be used to meet Trenton. And then power utilities, as many of you know, can ask for releases from Merrill Creek so they can continue to draw water from the river and not make an impact during drought. So how does this all work? So in the 1960s, we had very high salinity intrusion. This is using the salt front as an estimate of salinity intrusion. And it got up to, the salt front itself actually got up to river mile 100. After the drought in the 1960s, the 1970s was a pretty wet decade. And so we didn't see high salinity intrusion events. And then we had some dry periods, some quick hit dry periods in the 1980s. And although the Trenton flow objective was not established in the water code, there were some, there was a flow objective established via conservation orders from which the DRBC made releases from Blue Marsh and Beltsville at that time.
Hi.
To keep
You all right?
flows below,
Here.
I think 2,300. And then after the Trenton flow objective was established, basically reduced at different drought conditions in 1983. And since then, we haven't seen conditions where the salt front has been above river mile 90. Part of that is due to the flow objective, and I think part of that is due to the fact that we haven't had as dry conditions as in the 1960s. So that being said, you know, what do we, you know, if we haven't seen salt front get up that far, what's the big deal? Well, we have to be concerned about sea level rise. Although we don't often affiliate sea level rise and drought, it does have implications for drought because we have water users in the estuary and they can be impacted by salinity intrusion. This is a graphic that represents the estuary and the mixing of salty water from the ocean and fresh water from the land. So if you look at this as like two mixing bowls, the ocean is ocean water is coming from the left and fresh water is coming from the right. On the top is the estuary today, and on the bottom is the estuary with sea level rise. The arrows in the boxes represent the magnitude of the influence of ocean and fresh water have on the location of the salt front. You can see with sea level rise, the force of the ocean pushing salt upstream increases, while as the force of the water pushing, the force of fresh water coming downstream remains the same. So basically the salt front can move further upstream more often. So for this study, we wanted to address the impact or look at the impact of sea level rise on salinity management and determine if we would meet F.E. Walter. So there are a lot of different researchers coming up with estimates of sea level rise, and we looked at projections from a variety of sources. For work on another project, we used 0.5 and 0.3 and 0.5 meters of sea level rise. This happens to be a map of how sea level has rise, looking at Lewes, Delaware over time. And then on top of a graphic from the Corps of their sea level rise projections using a low, intermediate, and high rate of sea level rise. So this graph is based on the year 2000. And if you look at rates of sea level rise, this is where we are now from the baseline in 2000. It's estimated that sea level has risen between 0.07 meters and 0.15 meters since 2000. So currently sea level rise is in this area. So we're definitely like on the low curve, but we could be on the high curve. Anyway, so it looks like using 0.3 and 0.5 meters, it looks like we could see 0.3 meters of sea level rise as early as 2034. but it's likely based on intermediate curve by 2060, which is our planning horizon. But if you look at the high sea level rise curve, it looks like we could see 0.5 meters of sea level rise as early as 2048. And considering the amount of time that it takes to plan for design, fund and construct infrastructure, now is an appropriate time to be starting this study. Okay, so now here's my like psychedelic graphs, I think. Oops, not yet. So the first thing we did when we started to look at sea level rise was we developed a three-dimensional hydrodynamic model, and we simulated the different periods of time. And this is the results from a simulation of July through October 2002. It was one of our calibration periods. And I would say it was a more recent period for which we had a lot of more information than, say, simulating the 1960s. And if you kind of like, don't look at the numbers, but you can kind of see that as sea level rises, the range of the saline intrusion is going to increase. So you can see that we'll be by, so this is like the third driest multi-year period in our record. And you can see that with 1 meter of sea level rise, the soft front would be at river mile 98, which is similar to the saline management goal, and then it would definitely be above where it was in the 1960s. But this is only the third ranked dry period, so conditions will be much worse for the 1960s. So this is looking at the saline management goal and sea level rise. So this is the 30-day average of the 180 milligram per liter chloride concentration. These boxes are like the normal range where that concentration would be, and the green lines are where it's most likely to be, like greater than this 10%, 80% of the time, or 90% of the time, and less than this 10% of the time. And so you can see that even now, under current conditions, we reach the intake. There's potential that we would reach the drinking water intakes with sea level rise. So, and there's a lot to explain about this, but it's sort of too much to go into now. But basically, you can kind of see that, you know, basically with sea level rise, it looks like with 1.6 meters of sea level rise, we're getting it up to Bristol, you know, with high saline water. So that's a, you know, of concern. When that happens, it's another story. So after that, we used a, let's see. So what we did was we used our planning model, you might be familiar with, it's called the Delaware River Basin Planning Support Tool. And we simulated the FFMP, which is the current operational plan. It has the water code drought management operations. And we looked at how saline intrusion reported by the saline management goal of the 30-day moving average of 100 milligram per liter chlorides, and see if that criteria would be exceeded. So this is the 1960s drought, and you can see that at 0.3 meters, we get close to exceeding the criteria of keeping that value below river mile 98. But for 0.5 and 0.8 meters, we definitely exceed the criteria. You could say, well, that's only like 1 year in the worst dry record, but if you look at the entire record, in other dry periods, in the 1930s drought, it looks like even at 0.3 meters, we might get close to exceeding the criteria. And in 1957, we could get close to exceeding the criteria with 0.3 meters of sea level rise. So these are typical metrics. I realize it's an awful table that you have to look at, but there's some typical metrics that we looked at when we're comparing simulations. We have a list of like 200, but these are some of the key ones I think that make a difference for this analysis. So if we look at historic conditions, we make it through the drought with minimum storage in the New York City reservoirs of 16.1 billion gallons. During the worst part, the lower basin, you have a remaining storage of 12 billion gallons. and you never exceed the river mile 98 with the chloride concentration. But as sea level rise goes up, the amount of water that you need to repel salinity gets, is more extreme. You need much more water. And you can see that the reserve storage or the minimum storage in both upper and lower basin decreases significantly. But once you get to 0.5 meters, 0.5 meters, although the storage in the city reservoirs go down, the storage in the lower basin reservoirs, kind of holds constant. But you still have storage remaining, but you're exceeding that that threshold of river mile 98. So, it looks like we might be okay to 0.3, but when we get to 0.5, we're really depleting the storage and we're exceeding the saline management goal. So what I did was like, well, is there a way to use this water to not, to improve the situation, to not exceed river mile 98? And there are a lot of different ways that we could potentially to do that, but I looked at the Trenton flow objective. And so it's in, like, when you think about the Trenton, the drought management plan, if you're conserving water for water supply in a reservoir, it's important to conserve water during a drought. But if one of your goals of your drought management plan is to repel salinity, does it make sense to reduce the amount of water going downstream to repel, when the salt front is coming upstream? So I said, well, what if we eliminated the linkage of the Trenton flow objective, the downstream Trenton flow objective, during this watch and warning, right? And made it dependent on the location of the salt front all the time. So the flow objective would be independent of drought status, and you would only be releasing water, as the salt front came further upstream, you'd be releasing more water. So it's slightly different, basically, it's a slightly different idea where you essentially wouldn't be saving water downstream, but you would be only releasing water when you really needed it to repel the salt front. So you go back to these metrics again, and I only looked at 0.5 meters because this is when we start to really see the problem. And in this, and I looked at both the storage at F.E. Walter of only 6 billion gallons of drought storage, and then 11 billion gallons of drought storage. That's 6 billion and 11 billion in F.E. Walter, and then 6 billion and 11 billion gallon, but this one has the Trenton flow objective modified. So you can see that this a little bit more storage is used when you modify the Trenton flow objective, but you can basically eliminate a lot of the instances where the salt front goes, or where the salinity management goal exceeds the criteria, for almost all cases except for 1964. And so part of that is that we would need to tweak either when the river mile locations or these numbers somewhat, so that you don't run out of water too quickly, because what happens is in the 1960s is that you just run out of water a little too quickly. And then also here, you're throwing all your resources from the lower basin at the problem as well. In the model, there is a reserve storage in the lower basin reservoirs of 2 billion gallons. And so essentially this is like using all the storage in the lower basin except for those two reserve situation. And then also by using the Trenton flow objective, by modifying the Trenton flow objective, you would reduce the amount of time that the saline management goal wasn't being met from almost 5 months to around 1 or less than 1 month. So those are some of the options that we would look at of how to use the water in the lower basin and from F.E. Walter more efficiently to achieve our saline management goal. So then, one other option is, like we talked about, one of the purposes of F.E. Walter is flood control and to store water for either recreation or a drought emergency. The water is actually stored in the flood control pool. And so one of the contingencies in both the old drought water storage contracts and the recreation program is that if there's a forecast storm event, the Corps, at the Corps' discretion, they can release all the water from the pool, to create space for flood water. So that's currently the case for the recreation program. And so what we were thinking is that we could employ the concept of forecast informed reservoir operations, similar to, they were talking about this back in, when we did the old drought management contracts, and it's talked about in the recreation program, that, with an advanced warning, you can evacuate the pool. The Corps likes to be able to evacuate the recreation pool, or they'd like to be able to evacuate the recreation pool in 24 hours. And so their concern for this project is, or for drought emergency storage is, they're not sure that they could release the 11 billion gallons as opposed to 6 billion gallons in 24 hours. Well, our idea is sort of, you would look further out than 24 hours, you might look a week out. And if there's going to be a big storm, you might start releasing the water from 11 billion gallons to 6 billion gallons. It doesn't hurt us if we're in a drought, because any water going downstream helps repel the salt front and helps repel salinity. But, you could, if it turns out that, was it, I don't know, it was one of the hurricanes last year, they said we're going to get a lot of rain, and then it was like a bust. We didn't get any rain. So we wouldn't necessarily have released the whole pool, but we would still be at 1370, because our goal would be to try to get to 1370 1 to 2 days before the Corps had to make a decision about whether or not to release the whole pool. So that's kind of where the idea of forecast informed reservoir operations might come into play for this project, is that we could mitigate some potential impacts to, or we could mitigate or eliminate any increased flood risk by using the concept of fire. So we wouldn't change the flood risk. We would operate so that we maintain the same flood risk in terms of releasing the reservoir pool. So with all that, and I'm out of breath and very thirsty, we'll go to, I just put that into reference back to that, but you guys don't need to talk about it. So here's the current project status, and Jen will probably talk about this in a couple minutes as well. But the original project was for, I think, 260,000, 2.6 million. DRBC provided some funds and labor up to $400,000, and I think New York City provided $900,000 for the project. Once we started the project, the Corps felt that the $3 million in total wasn't enough. The project was too complex. We needed a bigger risk analysis, more modeling. They need to do their own modeling. And so they want to do a schedule and funding as a cost and schedule waiver, so that they could extend the length of the project and do a really thorough evaluation of alternative 2, and then plus the other alternatives. So that's sort of where we are now. We're sort of in a holding pattern, waiting to get that cost and funding waiver. So what would happen now is that they would continue working on risk analysis, do the modeling, and come up with a tentatively selected plan by, I think it's May 2023. They'd take comments and revise it, do a feasibility analysis by November 24, and they would develop a chief's report by September 2024. So it would extend the duration of the project by, I think, 2 years, right? So, so just in summary, I want to mention that FE Walter is a vital component of our drought management plan, and we need to be able to determine whether or not we can use it the way it is written in our water code. It doesn't seem like based on our modeling, it doesn't seem like the recreation and drought programs would conflict, except possibly in the most extreme conditions. We definitely need more water to address the increased frequency of saline intrusion due to sea level rise. We believe that forecast informed reservoir operations can be used to preserve the, to not add flood risk to the project if we do have drought emergency storage. As I mentioned, the project is continuing, but we're waiting for a schedule and funding waiver. And then our next steps as sponsors is to evaluate, to work with the Corps and determine how FE Walter can be operated in conjunction with other basin reservoirs and drought management plan components to repel salinity while still maintaining flood mitigation and recreation functions. So that's all I had, Jen.
Thank you, Amy. I don't have anything else to add. I think Amy covered it perfectly, other than, we are all for the time and funding waiver. This idea of using FE Walter is like almost 40 years old at this point. And can we just answer the question and can we move on one way or another? So that's really our thought process behind, pursuing this time and funding waiver. We really think it could be a good source of additional water for the river and really is a win-win for everyone when you lay it out.